In the early 1800s, a man showed up in the area of what is now Minerva, Ohio, with a note in his hand. The man's uncle had been in the same location decades earlier, where he helped bury 16 mule loads worth of gold and silver. This gold and silver was payroll to the French soldiers in the French and Indian War. All of the French soldiers that had helped bury this payroll had died, and the only link to that buried payroll was this letter that this man was carrying. This letter had clues to the location of the buried payroll. It was simple: solve the clues, find the payroll. This is the story of the lost payroll of Minerva, Ohio. Before the American Revolution, there was a lesser-known war called the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War lasted between 1754 and 1763 and was between the British and the French. However, both sides used competing native tribes, and the French used a lot of these because they were severely outnumbered by the British. The French and Indian War began with a dispute over the Allegheny River and the Forks of Ohio. The Forks of Ohio is now famous. It's Pittsburgh, but back then it was Fort Duchesne, held by the French. Interesting fact, the first violence of this war was in 1754 when a militia attacked a French convoy. That militia was led by a 22-year-old lieutenant general named George Washington. This was not only the beginning of the French and Indian War, but it also led to high tensions, which led to the 7-Year War in Europe. So George Washington was at least played a part in the beginning of that war. This is a really fascinating story, and you can read about it in the links below, so go check that out in the description. But we are here to find out about the French payroll that was buried after a battle at Fort Duchesne. Most of this story comes from the Minerva Commercial, April 3rd, 1875, which was a newspaper, and you can find a link to that article in the description below. In 1755, Fort Duchesne, now Pittsburgh, was a major hub for traffic. It was completely controlled by the French. To the east were the British colonies, and to the west and the north was New French, and it was completely controlled by the French. The British wanted to gain control of the Allegheny River and also Fort Duchesne because that controlled the forks and the rivers that went through there. The French payroll was also held at Fort Duchesne at this time, and the French knew that there was an imminent attack by the British to try and take control of this area, and that if the British got a hold of this payroll, not only would the French soldiers not get paid, their morale would drop. This was a large amount of gold and silver, and this would also aid the British in their efforts to control the area. Because this British attack was imminent, they needed to get that gold and silver out of there, so they loaded it up onto 16 pack mules, and 10 French soldiers guided these pack mules out. They took these pack mules out, headed to Northern Territory. They were on their way to Fort Detroit. About 80 miles to the northwest of Duchesne, these French soldiers got word that the British soldiers were on their trail and that they were about to overtake them, and that there was going to be another battle. They knew that only being 10 men, they probably didn't have a chance. They had no idea how many people were coming, but they knew that they were probably going to die or be captured, and they didn't want this payroll to get into the hands of the British soldiers. So they buried the payroll, and they marked trees and noted the area and made clues so that they, and only they, could come back and find the payroll at a later date. After they buried the payroll, the British attacked, and we know that only 2 men escaped. French soldiers actually came through the area later on, but they didn't know it was there. They passed right by. They didn't know that it had been lost. They didn't know that the 10 men didn't make it to Fort Detroit until they got there. So there was no way that they could look for it, or there was no way that they could find it because they didn't have the clues. So these 2 men escaped, but they kind of went out and went in hiding, and nobody ever heard about this payroll that had been buried there. None of the locals knew about it. The British military didn't know about it. Nobody kind of knew about it at the time, until decades later when a man showed up with a list of clues and said that one of those escaped men was his uncle. His uncle had recently died and left him those clues so he could go up to this area and find this payroll. So this man showed up in what is present-day Minerva, Ohio, and he began looking around for all of these clues. He let all of the locals know what he was doing, and he asked them for help. He said, here are the clues, and does anybody know where these items are? The clues on the letter explain where the payroll was buried. The payroll was buried in an area bound by 4 springs. A half a mile to the west of where the payroll was buried was a tree with a fork in it, and they took a strange, peculiar shaped rock and put it in the fork of the tree, which was about 11 feet up. 1 mile to the east, they carved a deer into a tree, and 600 steps north of the location of the buried payroll, they hid all of the shovels that they used under a large log. The locals had never heard of this before, so they didn't know anything about it, so they had never been looking for these clues. So the nephew of this French soldier searched for several years, not finding anything, not finding a single clue, and he finally just gave up and he left and he never came back. But with this, the locals in the area now knew all of the clues, and the locals found every single one of them. The shovels, or what remained of the shovels, was found on the property of a farmer named Mr. Robbins, which was actually quite a ways to the east of Minerva. A man named John Whitaker was chopping a tree when an odd-shaped rock came out of the tree. He noticed that this rock had been very near the fork of the tree and determined that somebody had placed the rock in the fork and that the tree had grown around it. John Whitaker immediately went out to where the rock was. He paced off the steps, and he dug and he dug and he dug, and he didn't find the treasure. Another interesting fact, this man John Whitaker, who found this peculiar rock, was the founder of Minerva, Ohio. One day a strong storm came through and blew the bark off a tree, and they went out afterwards and found the carving of the deer. So all of these clues were found, the location for all of these clues were found, and the locals and many people since have come and looked for this treasure. The Robbins farm has actually been dug up quite a bit. He used to dig looking for the treasure, and he would allow pretty much anybody to come out to his farm looking for it. He just wanted this payroll found. He thought it was an awesome story, and he wanted it found. But all of these clues have supposedly been found, and no one has found the payroll. This means that that payroll is still sitting out there, or someone, likely the British, when they came through, found out where it was, dug it up, and it's gone. But this area was basically a highway at this time, and there's tons of stuff out there. People find old muskets, they find musket balls, they find coins, they find buttons, they find all kinds of stuff out in this area, so it's a great place to go looking for treasure anyway. I hope you enjoyed the story. If so, don't forget to like, leave comments, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.